This is a book that most people are going to go, what are you talking about? I have no idea. So let's start a bit with learning about Lesslie Newbigin. First of all, who is he? And how did you get into Lesslie Newbigin? The guy named Leslie. I mean, that's a little bit strange there, but
and with two S's.
With two S's too. It's like, what, where's he from? Anyway.
Many scholars spell his name with one S and then put two G's in Newbigin. And he always wondered if they're compensating or something. But anyway, who is he and how did I get into him are great questions. Here's how I got it. I was teaching my first worldview course, and I asked a worldview scholar who'd been teaching for years, what are you using? He was using his own book. As you might expect, he was using another fairly well-known book by Niebuhr called Christ and Culture. And then he's using this third book called Foolishness to the Greeks by Lesslie Newbigin. And I said, what is that book? And who is Lesslie Newbigin? Well, this came at the end of about 7 years. I'd been a church planter. I had planted the church and I was pastoring it. It was in the Toronto, Canada area, very neo-pagan. And I am trying to understand what it means to bring the gospel to this area. And then I read this book by Lesslie Newbigin called Foolishness to the Greeks. I'd love to tell you more about this, but for the first 20 pages of that book, I read over and over and over again. And I was saying, this guy is onto something, and I don't know what it is, but he's onto something that is speaking to me as a church planter that is frustrated. I'm frustrated because I'm being offered a confessionalism that is conservative on the one side. It's wonderfully biblical and theological, but not relevant. And the church growth movement on the other side is wonderfully relevant, but not rooted in scripture and theology. And I don't know a way forward other than balancing on both feet. And here is someone that is bringing me into a new paradigm, a new vision that's going to help me understand what I've been doing for 7 years. And so I'm reading these 20 pages over and over, trying to make sense of them. In the meantime, running down to my wife about every hour saying, you got to hear this. You got to hear this. This is resolving so many of my issues. You got to hear this. And I tried to figure out what he was doing. To make a long story short, I started realizing that here is a man that was one of the best known Christians of this time, one of the best known authors. This is in the late 80s. I began church planting in the early 80s. I'm reading his book in the late 80s. And I'm starting to realize that this is the books of this man are some of the best-selling books going on right now. He's written 2 or 3 books that are exploding on the scene. And I realize I'm not the only one that this is happening to. I'm one of many that this is happening to. And so I find out, who is this man? And I realize here's who he is in a nutshell. He's a fellow that has a long history in India. He's been 40 years a missionary in India. He's been a public figure for long through that period, but he's been a missionary in India for 40 years. He has now returned to England after 40 years. And he's now looking at England and the whole of Europe, and for that matter, the whole of Western culture through a new set of lenses. It's almost like his 40 years of experience has given him a new set of glasses to look at the culture in a missionary way. The way a missionary, when it goes to a Hindu or a Muslim or a Buddhist culture, and the way they have to understand how that culture deeply affects everything. Now he's coming back to a culture that is claiming to either be Christian or neutral. And he's realizing it's neither. What it is neo-pagan, it's deeply humanistic, and it is a religion that is just as dangerous, if not more so, than Hinduism or Islam. And so he's coming back, and he's with his new missionary eyes, he's asking huge questions about how the church is to live faithfully in that culture. And he writes an article that has become quite famous, where he says that the Western church is, quote, an advanced case of syncretism, an advanced case of syncretism. Now, what is syncretism? Syncretism, here's one of his stories. Syncretism is when he goes into a Hindu temple, and that Hindu temple has many figures around the temple. And over here on this one side is a picture of Jesus with an altar before it, where on Christmas Day, you come before the altar of Jesus, offer food to him, and you pray and worship Jesus on that day among many other gods. He said missionaries would recognize quickly that's not Christianity. That's not a foothold for Christ in Hindu culture. That's syncretism. Christ has been absorbed into the idolatry of Hindu culture. And he says he started to realize that this is exactly what was happening in the West. The West, because they thought the culture was neutral or Christian, had allowed the gospel and their lives to be absorbed syncretistically into the idolatry of humanist, neo-pagan culture. And so he mounts a challenge to that and starts writing books that start to expose the idolatrous roots and the way it's beginning to shape the Western church. And so here am I, a young, not quite 40-something, I guess, pastor, kind of turning towards the academy at the time, toward starting a PhD work, starting to say, oh my goodness, he's speaking my language. He is speaking what I have seen in the Toronto area. He is speaking to the exact things, and I'm starting to realize that this church growth movement is deeply syncretistic. And the problem is with this confessionalism, it's got great stuff from a contextualized past that's not speaking to the present. What I need is somehow to bring that tradition and the gospel forward into the present in a way that begins to challenge the syncretism of the Canadian church.